Yeah.
Yes. Hello, Aniruddha.
Hi,
Great to
Manoj.
see you. Yeah,
Yeah. How are you?
I've. It's amazing to see memoirs written by you at a relatively young age. How old are you? Let's begin with that.
I'm not that young. I'm 53 right now. I turned
Well,
53 this month. So,
I don't think very many people write memoirs at 53. Certainly not journalists, because for a lot of them, their best years would probably be still ahead. But in your case, I saw you, way back in 1993, 94 in India Today magazine when you had just joined the desk there. And I gathered from your book that it was more or less your first job.
that's right.
And you had an amazing growth since then. The kind of mark you made in the profession, uh, I mean, by any standards, you are recognized as a pioneer in the field of undercover reporting. I'm, you know, advisedly using that expression because I know that you are averse to the more commonly used sting journalism, but we'll come to that in due course. Um, but I would think that a lot of your phenomenal impact has had to do with, the expression that you used as the title of your book, A Taste for Trouble. It's really is evocative of who you are or the kind of journalism you've done. It's marked by its your incredible courage, your enterprise, your adventurousness, your the tenacity you've displayed against all odds, in story after story. So that, and in publication after publication, I mean, it's in Outlook and Tehelka, which you co-founded, and then your own publication now, that is Cobrapost.
That's right.
So let's come back to my the first question. Why memoirs at 53?
Sorry, why?
Why did you write your memoirs at 53?
No, it was a combination of, there were many stories to tell. I mean, it's very unfair to ask a writer why now. So I just felt that my daughters have grown up and they should hear about certain of my childhood stories, etc. So it got around. I got around to writing because of that, and then the childhood stories were not enough. Then I had to get into the work that me and the team associated with me had done over the years. So it became a sort of, that's why I called it Memories. It is not a full blown autobiography, it's memories. So I selected, there were many memories I had to leave out, there were many memories I didn't go into. So it was a basic case of leaving out many memories. And then the memories that sort of I wanted to go public with, I went out with it.
I concede that it was an unfair question to ask you. If nothing else, your modesty would have prevented you from answering, frankly, that you have amazing fund of stories. It's not uncommon for journalists to struggle. It's not uncommon for journalists to face danger, but your stories still stand out because the kind of adventures you have had are uncommon. So your struggles have also been uncommon, and the stories you have shared here are not only going to be instructive to journalists of all ages, especially the younger ones, uh, but they're also very inspiring. And I also find your book extremely timely because it's come out at a time when the profession has a bad odor to it. Uh, you know, we're just going through this farmers' agitation, and what it brought home to us is that even these farmers coming from rural areas, remote areas, when they come across any journalist, the kind of derision that spontaneously comes out of their mouths, the way they are questioning, the way they are attacking journalists, calling them godi media, and so on and so forth. So what your book shows is what journalism can be or could have been and or can still be. It's that it can be impartial, that it can be in the spirit of fourth estate. You could be doing a lot of what is expected of you, that is watchdog journalism. In fact, much of your journalism was done, you blossomed at a time when the basic fault line of the profession was between watchdog journalism and access journalism. But unfortunately, in recent years, access journalism has degenerated to lapdog journalism. So what we have today is essentially watchdog journalism versus lapdog journalism, where journalists don't speak truth to power. They instead attack whoever is criticizing the government, whether they are from civil society or opposition, or members of any marginalized community. They show no kind of empathy and so on and so forth. So how do you look back at all this, given the kind of journalism you did? I'm again asking you a general question. I'll come to specifics in due course. How do you feel about it?
I mean, you talked about watchdog and lapdog journalism. I don't see any watchdog journalism these days. So you are saying there are two strains. I don't see the watchdog strain at all.
Yeah,
So
you're right. It has increasingly shrunk. Yeah.
even if you compare it to the two UPA regimes, you had a series of scams being pursued by journalists across media platforms, whether it was 2G or Coal or Others or Commonwealth scam, and there were a whole series of stories that used to keep happening. Journalists made reputations on those stories. Journalists took on the establishment on those stories and felt the way they empowered people. Institutions took those stories forward, whether it was the CAG or whether it was the Supreme Court. So a lot of it happened, and the stories became big because the institutions also kicked in. But these days, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, and we don't see that kind of journalism. And there's a whole middle level journalist across media platforms, who are really frustrated by the inability to do meaningful journalism.
Yeah, you are right in pointing out that this watchdog journalism, the space for it has shrunk, especially in the mainstream media. So whatever little you see of watchdog journalism is essentially in alternative platforms, and uh, and even those who dare to do that kind of journalism are hounded by lawsuits, and how institutions are no more standing by them. And it is remarkable that you believe that that institutions were more credible or more supportive in the past. This It's remarkable because you didn't have an easy time after you did your humongous story on defense deals, uh, which is called Operation West End, and there's a whole book written on it by Madhu Trehan. It depicts the kind of hounding you were subjected to, you and others associated with that story were associated with, were subjected to, and you still believe that it is worse now than it was then. Why do you say so?
You see, I say that in the sense that at that time there was a lot of judiciary was as an institution, we all felt confidence that they would have our back. They would have the back of journalists in any slugfest that you had with the state. But now more and more journalists are perhaps losing that confidence, and which is very, very tragic. I hope they do not lose that confidence. But unfortunately, some of them are. And actually, I wouldn't even say that. If the media platforms are not attempting those kind of stories, and those kind of stories are not coming in friction with the state, we really wouldn't know how the judiciary is going to react. But seeing from the manner in which the state as well as lower judiciary is reacting to Facebook posts and generally behaving about freedom of expression issues, it is a natural corollary for any body to believe that in major issues also they might take the side of the regime, which is what is causing a lot of frustration and lack of confidence in the journalists.
Yeah. So what was tough and challenging earlier has become far worse now. So it wasn't easy for you even earlier, but it's
Yeah.
uh, yeah. Uh, so before we move to other stories which you did, which you are so well known for. I would like you to reflect on this Operation West End, because before you did this, you had launched that platform, Tehelka, and it wasn't the same after this experience of yours. How it impacted you, and it led to your dissociation with with the organization, with the publication that you co-founded. So how did it happen that way?
No, I mean, I left. I mean, I co-founded Tehelka along with Tarun Tejpal and Minty Tejpal, and then I basically exited in 2003 itself, before the magazine version of Tehelka, and it was like leaving your own sort of product and your own sort of lifeblood. But at that time, our thoughts differed. I wanted to go the investigative journalism route, and Tarun had this larger vision of a newspaper and a rounded product, and I wasn't really interested too much in a rounded product. And of course, the other differences came up, which are minor and major, but then things happen and people move on to other things. So we just moved on, that's all.
And this was while you were still fighting those Operation West End related legal
That's
battles.
right. The commission was disbanded only in 2004, by which time I had already left. At that time, actually, Justice Fukan had taken over Justice Venkat Swamy in the Commission of Inquiry, if you remember. Later on, because Justice Venkat Swamy resigned because of some comments by Congress politicians, etc. And then Justice Fukan came in, but we had already boycotted the commission at Justice Fukan's time, that we don't want to take part in the commission anymore, because we were unsure of the fairness of the commission at that point of time. And we felt that it was largely an exercise into going after us rather than the truth of what our investigation showed. And so that lack of confidence, we felt that we should not legitimize the commission by participating in it at that stage.
Yeah. And then after you quit Tehelka, which was in a sense your baby, you set up your own publication, that is Cobrapost. And despite your aversion to calling your brand of journalism, the one that you pioneered, that you made, you took to a different level. You were, I see you as a practitioner of watchdog journalism, but with a difference. That is that you say there might be others who essentially pour over documents and parse them and then come up with stories. What you did was you. When I say pioneered, I don't mean that you were the first one to do undercover reporting, because, while we were still students, we heard these stories about the great Kamala story from Indian Express done by Ashwin Sareen. That was also undercover reporting. But when you came on the scene, you took it to a different level, partly because of the way you deployed technology, which was, emerging at that time, those secret cameras and so on and so forth, right? Not all your stories involve that, but a lot of your stories, especially this Operation West End, did involve that. And that is how, the major casualty of that story was Bangaru Lakshman. I mean, that was because of your secret camera, right? So you then founded this this Cobrapost, where you chose a name which is, whether you like it or not, evocative of sting journalism, because you called it Cobrapost, right? So what do you have to say about that?
It wasn't really with that in mind. Cobrapost, generally snakes in Indian mythology are guardians of both knowledge and wealth. So it came out with that connotation, and it also came out with the connotation of that the name had a high recall value. So these were the two reasons only that I came up with. I'm a sort of, in the Indian context, I thought it would be relevant. And with regard to, we have done all kinds of investigations, whether it is RTI or document based. It is just that the hidden camera investigations make a lot of noise, and people remember that the most. So, which is why people say that we specialize in undercover, which is not really true. I mean, we specialize, yes, but we specialize in all forms of investigative journalism. But to touch on your point about technology coming in, You see, if you are taking on the establishment, if you are taking on MPs, taking money to ask questions in the Indian Parliament, first of all, we do it on prior information. Middlemen take us to those people who are indulging in it. It is not a fishing expedition, as I keep telling people. But because, I mean, we could have written the story like the Kamla story, and nobody would have known that we have used hidden cameras. And possibly hidden camera wasn't used in the Kamla story. But in situations where you take on the establishment, there's a high burden of proof. And that burden of proof can only be a recording. And in today's multimedia age, that recording became an economic product. So apart from being a burden of proof, it also became an economic output in the sense of footage for TV channels and internet media, etc., etc. So it became a business stream on its own, in the sense, not a business commercial stream, but in the sense of sustaining a investigative unit. So in that sense, that was the byproduct of your burden of proof, is what I say.
Yeah. And since you just mentioned, referred to your famous story on cash for questions, I may tell you at this point that when I saw your book, the section dealing with that, I thought you undersold yourself there. There's so much more you could have written about it, because to my mind, what was most significant about it was not just the fact that it led to the expulsion by parliamentary committees of as many as 11 MPs. I mean, in terms of sheer impact, it's unparalleled. On the basis of your undercover reporting, which showed that against payment, MPs were willing to raise questions, and all sorts of horrendous questions. The way you, with your own sense of humor, described, how you named something after Catch 22 and so on and so forth. They never caught on, and those questions were actually put before Parliament, and they elicited some kind of responses. So all that served to shock the institution, and these committees set up by each of those houses took action, and 11 MPs were expelled. And when they in turn challenged their expulsion, that's the part which I thought was missing from your book. The Supreme Court upheld their expulsion, and that also entailed an endorsement, a resounding endorsement from the highest court of the land of this undercover reportage, because people raise questions about it, make all sorts of allegations and insinuations saying that this is not journalism and so on and so forth. Whereas we've had the Supreme Court itself showing that for certain kind of stories where there is no other way of getting to the truth, it is perfectly legitimate for a journalist to resort to undercover journalism and bring out the truth. And that was a great.
And Justice Dhingra in the High Court also gave an excellent judgment on that at that time.
Yeah. So it also established the credentials of your operations. It was not, as you said, fishing expedition. You had some middlemen who were available to provide that kind of service, and wherever they took you. So it was across party lines. So they were not just from Congress or BJP. They were people from different parties, and they were all expelled. So that is something that is a milestone in the history of journalism. Thanks to the great work that you and um, your organization did. Now, another great thing, this is another favorite of mine, is the story you did on Bihar massacres for Cobrapost by your very enterprising reporter, Kumar Ashish. You did several stories, and this is one excellent one, where you actually traced uh, culprits who had been exonerated by the court in the context of Lakshmanpur Bate, which is by far the largest killings of Dalits in a single episode. And there, as many as 4 of them you traced, and you caught them on your hidden camera, bragging about their exploits, how they were there on the spot, and how they perpetrated a whole lot of killings.
That's right.
So that was an
That's right.
amazing story. Do tell us about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was because the reporter went and tracked down the people who had been accused of the crime and made them basically confess to those crimes. And some of them, as you rightly pointed out, had been exonerated or were in the process of litigation on this. And perhaps in some of them, the litigation is still going on. And I remember a lot of Dalit organizations, the heads of a lot of Dalit organizations coming to me with tears in their eyes and saying that they were so moved by the story that for the first time you had the killers who had sort of troubled them in a very feudal way coming and confessing to the crimes. And a lot of them at that point of time thought that a lot will come out of the story. But there was no suo motu judicial sort of taking up of the matter, and that was very tragic in that sense at that point of time.
Mm. And what you also brought out is you on hidden camera you got to speak to Justice Amir Das. It's a commission that had been set up to look at political connections with this militia or this private army of Bhumihar,
Yeah,
that is Ranveer Sena, and
yeah,
he talks at length about how he was close to bringing out a report which was going to be embarrassing to a lot of political leaders uh, from BJP and JDU and so on, and even RJD. And talking about killings reminds me of another great story that you did on 84 riots, a follow up to that. It was another amazing story of yours where you caught on hidden camera Shurveer Singh Tyagi, who was the SHO of the Trilokpuri area, where the highest number of killings took place. 300 or 400 Sikhs in East Delhi were killed. Tell us something about that. I mean, how did that happen? How did that story come about?
a lot of the stories that we pursued have been in investigation for many years and decades, in fact. And we wanted to get at the truth of a lot of these charge sheets and the accused therein. And so the reporter chased up a lot of those people who, under whose thana, a lot of the mischief had taken place, especially in the 84 sort of Sikh genocide that happened. And he managed to get some amazing stuff, which people in charge of Thana is talking about stories and what had happened actually under their watch. And it was very, I mean, some of it had not come out before, and some of it actually endorsed the work of what a lot of commissions had been saying earlier. And so, a lot of these old investigations that have happened, and people think that people just confess. They don't. You have to really get at the root of the matter. You have to follow the charge sheet. For instance, the story that we did on the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and we went to each of the a majority of the accused in that CBI charge sheet, and got them talking about how they had planned for the even demolition of the masjid, and a lot of them confessed that the training had been going on for months, and they were preparing, and how they had constituted a Lakshman Sena and this and that. They just confessed to everything. They just did that. It was not a spur of the moment thing. It was basically a pre-planned conspiracy. So, I mean, if the accused themselves are saying that, but the accused and the court, are saying that, but a media investigation and then a court proceedings are two totally different things.
Yeah. In fact, the example you cited of this Ram Janmabhoomi case is indicative yet again of the kind of meticulous research that precedes your hidden camera operation, because you do your basic groundwork, you zero in on people who are actually involved in those cases, either as accused or people who had, as in the Bihar case, already exonerated, or as in the 84 case, people who were part of the state apparatus and had very important questions to answer but had already been either shielded or exonerated. So you go back to them and come up with revelations, very significant revelations. So that gives the light to the claim that this is some kind of muckraking, that you go to people at random, some sensationalizing stuff. Nothing of that sort. I mean, it's sensational, all right, but it is something that involves a whole lot of legwork, very meticulous research, and you also have to go through these documents to arrive at this information. Yeah.
Documents and find out the names of the accused. They have to
Yeah.
find out what they said in statements and what are they
Yeah.
saying now, or what the
Yeah.
investigative officers had maintained, what they are saying now. So it is a whole. And when you are pursuing these legal stories, then there's a whole lot of meticulousness involved in pursuing them.
Yeah. Yeah. And they all stood the test of time. It's not as if they got you caught in cases where you found yourself unable to substantiate what you showed. So, in fact, I remember asking Ashish about Bihar stories, whether any of those leaders or uh, policemen or judges got back. I mean, he was shrugging his shoulders and saying, they, since it's all done with such rigor, they would dare not come back to you, because they would fear further exposure. So it's something that stood the test of time and so on. Now, uh, the one big section of your book, and rightly so, major part of your journalism, I mean, this relates especially to the earlier part of your career, had to do with cricket, right? After you quit India Today, you joined this very remarkable publication, Down to Earth, where you did, where you probably cut your uh, investigative, your journalism teeth over there. Because if I'm not mistaken, you didn't do much of that kind of work in India Today. So it started at an unlikely publication like Down to Earth, right? Am I right there?
Yeah, Down to Earth was a lovely space where they gave you a lot of time to pursue science and environment stories. And I pursued a lot of stories on toxic waste disposal in Gujarat and
Yeah.
Maharashtra. And we were chasing a lot of toxic waste of companies and how they were disposing of sludge and how they were not sort of treating effluent waste and doing the economics of it. So that place gave me a thrill of chasing stories like that. So possibly the genesis of the chasing stories bit, I think, came to me from Down to Earth, where Uday Shankar incidentally was my boss in Down to Earth.
Yeah. And it shows the sheer range of stories you did over the years. It started with environmental stories, and then you joined Outlook, where you raised eyebrows, where you shook a very, very influential establishment in the country, that is cricket. So tell us about that.
Yeah,
How it all started.
the cricket match fixing story, when me and Krishna Fazad first broke it, people thought that we were running a mouse, and it wasn't really true. And there was a lot of pushback that we received from the establishment. The Board of Cricket of Control in India sued us for rupees 5 crore. At that time, Dalmia was the chief of the BCCI, and Bhinra was also there. And then there was this whole thing. Even journalists used to think that we are just running a mouse. At that time, India Today was a fortnightly, and when our story broke, actually they also turned a weekly. So people thought that we had done it just to sort of compete with India Today, but that was not the case at all. And being in a weekly magazine cycle, it gave you the luxury of time. And it also, in some respects, made access not that much important like it was to a newspaper reporter, for whom access meant life and blood, because he had to go to those players for interviews and the managers for their interviews and comments. So that wasn't all that important for us as weekly reporters. Not even weekly. Sometimes we used to do cricket maybe once a fortnight. So in that sense, there was a lot of luxury there, and there was also the thirst for chasing a story. I mean, how many match reports can you do? Cricket is one thing, but if something was happening in the underbelly of cricket, then there were a billion people, Indians, who were interested, and even more outside.
Yeah, I mean, what was remarkable also was the fact that you are not a full-fledged or a full-time sports journalist or a cricket journalist. So you were an outsider. So it became easier for you to,
Journalist, because I was doing all kinds of reporting, and sports was just one aspect of it.
yeah. So that might also have played a role that you didn't have too many IOUs. So you could be more candid in your approach.
Yes, I could. I had a career apart from being a sports journalist. I mean, I could do much other reporting. Which
Yeah.
sports journalists are generally typecast as sports journalists, but I was back of the features book. So I was doing a lot of back of the book features. So it wasn't really just sports. The sports,
Hmm.
though, became a big part of it for a long time because it became very interesting, and it brought a lot of travel, and so it was a lot of fun to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there was a 5 crore suit by BCCI. What happened to that? And what were the allegations? How did you defend yourself?
At some point they withdrew it because it became too much of a mocking stock with everybody, and it was like a laughing they made a laughing stock of themselves, and it's the series of stories, after that we went and did other stories. We broke the Pakistan match fixing story in the Outlook magazine, then we broke Manoj Prabhakar's thing with us in Tehelka. So there was a whole the Mark Walk Shane Warne thing that happened in Australia, and
Then that
so the
farcical
board
inquiry by
the Hansi Kronia incident happened, and the board's own inquiry found players guilty. So the events took over, and that suit became, inconsequential and they themselves withdrew it at some point.
No, there was a time when actually the board got a farcical inquiry conducted by Justice Chandrachud, who, if I remember right, exonerated players, right?
It was quite comical, and
Yeah,
they had also called me, and I took out my
yeah,
tape and I wanted to him to hear a particular match fixing tape that I had at that point of time, and he just thought that I had brought in the plague, and he just didn't want to listen to any of it. He said, no, 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 we're not interested. And actually, the BCCI staff at that time had arranged for a speaker and tape and everything else, because I had told them before that a tape would be played. But when Justice Chandrachud came in the room and he saw all that paraphernalia, he really panicked and he just said, no, I just don't want this, any of it. Just take it out. So whatever you have to say orally, you can say, but don't play anything.
so
So
the
that was
report that he came out, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, the report that he came out with might have been a setback to you then at that point of time because it sort of
He came out
invalidated your story.
came out with a report which was quite wishy-washy, which gave the
Hmm.
BCCI a lot of sort of face-saving, face-saving report, so to speak. But
Yeah,
then events took over. You see, you might want to do that, and you might succeed in doing that. At that time, Mr. Dungarpur was, in the powers to be, along with Mr. Dalmia and others. So, but then the events took over, and you couldn't really control what was happening in other boards and what other players were doing, and the Mumbai police investigation of Hansi Cronier, and so when it goes to that level, and then the CBI started investigating the players in India, and
yeah,
so when the state agencies got in, what can the BCCI do after that? So they had to just take it on the chin, and but they never apologized for their behavior prior to all this. They never apologized for the fact that they had sued us. They never apologized for the fact that uh, they had sort of blamed us. In fact, in a lot of stadiums, they had put up instructions that if they see me, I have to be hounded out of the stadium. They did that in Dhaka, in Bangladesh.
yeah,
So there was
yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
friction
You
and
mentioned
sort
that,
of
right?
Tom and Jerry thing happening between us when I was reporting
Yeah,
cricket.
yeah. So, as I said, there were lots of very inspiring things in your book. This is certainly one such example because when you first did your story, you and Krishna Prasad did that story on match fixing. You could not have imagined then that it was going to grow this big and acquire all these other ramifications, go around the world. So you sort of, lit the fire, so to say. You didn't know where else it would go lead, and uh, when Chandrachud came up with a report condemning your story in the sense, it must have been disheartening to you. But then, as you said, events overtook that
It was
report. Yeah,
disheartening in the moment before other
yeah,
events took over, and but then by that time we had already had a track record of breaking many stories, and then Manoj Prabhakar did an interview with us when we
yeah,
started Telka, naming Kapil
yeah,
Dev as the player who had come to him and asked him to throw
yeah,
a game. I mean, that's what Manoj Prabhakar said. So that took the
yeah.
story forward, and by that time the CBI had already initiated an inquiry.
Hmm.
So, I mean, we got a lot of egg on their face, BCCI. But what I was most troubled about was a board had an ostrich-like attitude. They were not willing to hear anything bad about the sports under what was happening under their own noses. So, which was a very ostrich-like attitude. I felt that the board should have been more proactive. If they had been more proactive at that stage, they would perhaps have stamped it out earlier.
Yeah. And the other big story that happened was, um, about stalkers. This was before the 2014 election. Would you tell us something about that? How it happened and how it played out? Uh,
Yeah, it was basically about you know
Politically sensitive story that was.
a, a woman being surveilled in Gujarat, and police officers surveilling a woman and reporting to the then minister,
Yeah.
and about certain occasions about how the woman was being surveilled and for whatever reason that she was being surveilled. So that was an
Hmm.
important story that time because it came out pre 2014 elections.
Yeah.
And in that sense, if you look at it, I couldn't put all the stories that Cobrapost had done, but we put a huge chunk of stories that we had done, and so some of those
Yeah.
stories remain in my head. And the makings of a story, the sources actually would be unfair to comment on that, and how it happened. That stories happen. You see, what is tragic is today you are more worried. You are less worried about story. Getting the story and getting it right is the easy part, but all
Hmm.
journalists are worried about the aftermath of when you do the story. So it becomes
Yeah.
more tragic for journalists if they have to really plan. Earlier media platforms used to stand by the journalists. These days they are the first to sort of say no, no, no. Even in columns, that guest columns that you could be writing for other publications, you would have this line at the end that the views of the columnists are their own. The media platform has got nothing to do with those views.
Hmm.
So they have a standoff approach even towards their own staff. So in that situation, for journalists to have the courage to go out is very unfair, and
Hmm.
it's for the journalist to worry about what is going to happen later. Will his own media platform back him? Will the courts back him? It becomes an impossible task to be doing some good journalism these days.
Yeah. And yet, over the years, just as Tehelka has been a nursery for a lot of investigative journalists, even after you left, um, as a magazine. I mean, there are so many big names that have emerged from that publication, and they did a lot of the kind of stories that you pioneered, right? Um, Whether it was in the context of Gujarat riots or so on. Sorry, I can't hear you. What were you saying?
Ashish Ketan did an amazing Gujarat story.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was it was amazing for two reasons. One, that it went into the judicial process,
yeah,
and two, it was judicially examined at each step of the way and continued to
yeah,
be examined, and it led to a whole series of convictions.
yeah.
So it is
So,
not some story that just happened and went away. It led to convictions, and it led to a judicial oversight over it. It was a bit like
yeah,
Operation 10. I mean, you had the commission, then you had the CBI takeover, and then you had a lot of
yeah,
convictions in the
mm,
court because of the CBI investigation.
yeah,
So there
yeah,
was a judicial interference, judicial application of mind, and they found
yeah.
the tapes kosher. They found it a great. In fact, the judge in that case quoted
In
from the investigation.
In the Naroda Patia case.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the point I was making was that when you set up your own publication, Cobra Post, uh, again that served as a nursery for so many investigative journalists. So how do you do these kind of stories with them when you have so many odds stacked against you? How do they come to you? How do you train them, uh, nurture them? I mean, how will you tell us a little about the leadership, the mentoring role that you have been playing?
See, I've been an investigative journalism. I mean, I've been an investigative journalist, and I know what goes through a reporter's mind. And I think there are a few givens if you are pursuing long-term stories. You need time, you need talent, you need the backing from the organization. You need an editor who has that same temperament and who knows that these kind of stories take time to develop. And obviously, you need resources to chase those stories. So there is, talent, time, resources, and you don't have to listen to lawyers and accountants. I mean, any great story, if you start listening to lawyers, then you cannot do it, because the lawyers will advise you every step of the way. No, don't do it. That is too risky. And there's this law and there's that law. So, but overall, you have to have common sense. You have to know the laws, but doesn't mean you have to be scared of them. And because the stories are not judicial in nature. You see, a lot of people confuse that our story should be legally sort of sound. The law comes later. You have to have common sense and you have to chase stories. But what is happening right now is that a lot of middle level pool is gathering rust. They're not chasing stories. They're losing the skill to lose stories. If you remember, after Tehelka and even after the success of Cobrapost, a lot of television bureaus set up special investigative teams, SITs, and not, except for one or two, none of them really had any success, because they were headed by people who didn't have the temperament, who would see these reporters not doing anything for a month and who would get angsty that nothing is coming out. And then they would put them in daily reporting. The moment you put a reporter in daily investigative reporting and daily reporting, you're getting no investigative story out of him, because he doesn't have the time and resources or the mental bandwidth to be pursuing them. I mean, there are two totally different things. So they couldn't develop that temperament, and a lot of them did. If you look at the investigative bureaus around the country, a lot of them are basically old Cobrapost staff and old Tehelka staff. So it's populated by the only organization which pursued investigative journalism in a very, very specified and rigorous way. So, I mean, you didn't have that talent anywhere else.
As a journalist who worked in an organization where the stock reply that my editor often gave when we were about to set out on a story would be, okay, when we ask, okay, what's the deadline? When would you want the story? So he would say with a smile on his face, of course, but the answer would invariably be yesterday, meaning, you have to do it as quickly as possible. And then another facetious remark that would be made is, you're not writing a PhD, right? This is journalism. So this is the kind of attitude they would take, right? But I know for a fact from your book and otherwise that there are several stories of yours, investigative stories, which took months on end. You would work on it, on one story, and then what comes out, if it has that kind of original revelations, it's not a coincidence. I mean, it takes that kind of effort and sacrifice. So will you please tell us some of those examples? I mean, how long those big stories took?
Operation Western itself took about 8 months, and then Janbhoomi took actually more than a year, more in fact, more than maybe 1.5 years. Ram Janbhoomi story, because we had to catch them, and meeting all of them was not easy. You had to go. Sometimes the meeting didn't happen. The reporter came back, and then we went to some of them twice and thrice. So it's not just one meeting. You have a meeting, then you come back, you don't get enough, and then you wait, and when you get another chance, then you go to them again. So it happened over several months and years, and slowly the story was developed. And then there is the editing process, there's the transcribing process, then there's the editing process, and then there is the writing process. So there's a whole series of editing functions that happen along the way, and people just see the ultimate product and then they make their own judgments. No, this could have been there, this could have been there. Of course, I mean, the same thing happened with Operation West End. When it went through a judicial process later, and people in Justice Venkateswamy Commission of Inquiry, they didn't understand that. Even the judge at times didn't understand that the story grew incrementally in value every day. It didn't emerge full baked. When it started off, none of us thought where we would reach, where the middlemen would take us. There was no. I mean, there was a certain desirability that it could go. There was certain guesswork, but we never knew where we would go. So there was this sense in them that we knew from the beginning where the story would go and why we hadn't done that and why we hadn't crossed our T's and why we didn't do that. So it was a little too comical for us that they wouldn't understand the simple process that the story grew incrementally over months. It didn't just emerge. It's not a pack of documents that somebody gives you on Monday and then you have the whole story and you just have to write it up. The material was gathered over weeks and months, and so that is the beauty of investigative. If you love it, you're hooked to it, and you have to really like to chase stories. And a lot of our people who have done good stories are not really investigative journalists in India because they don't know how to chase a story. They are just, by the value of the media platform they are in, they get a whole bunch of documents. It could be an RTI, it could be, and they just regurgitate it. They don't chase the story, so to speak. So there are very few journalists in India who really chase stories.
Yeah. And talking about media, the one story that you say sort of cost you very dearly within the profession, that ostracized you, that made you a pariah, was very evocatively titled Operation, or intriguingly titled Operation 136. You chose that title because that was a rank India had in media freedom index.
Right? The paid news investigation.
The paid news. Yeah. So tell us about that, because that took your journalist, your reporter, to somebody as powerful as Vineet Jain, the owner of the Times Group, and the kind of lame excuse he gave for falling to that.
The story had great ramifications even in the current context. I mean, we keep saying that a lot of mainstream media is basically being used as a megaphone by the regime and the system, whether it is state governments or even state governments are also not innocent here. It's not just the central government. There are various non-BJP state governments who have the same fascist-like attitude in India right now, which is very dangerous. But if you look at the paid news story, you would see that the mainstream media publications were willing to publish Hindutva-related content, which would put a particular political party in a favorable light and denigrate the others. They were willing to do that, and they were willing to do that for a price. Now imagine that kind of story breaking in the West, and Fox News was blamed for something, and CNN was blamed for something. I don't think those media organizations would survive those kind of stories, but these organizations did. And that is very tragic that in spite of doing what they did, in spite of the ownership, that story was not about journalists, it was about owners and management. And the owners and management, willing to do what they were willing to do is very tragic to the Indian context. And that leaves the content suspect. You have to always read between the lines when you are sort of imbibing mainstream content. What is the agenda here? What is the main purpose? And one thing which I keep telling people is that a great media subject has to be introduced in preschool. I mean, not preschool, sorry, in your middle school, is about how to imbibe media and
how to consume media.
That's right. That's right. How to consume media, and that has to be a subject in itself. Because if you are going to take a WhatsApp forward as gospel truth, then there's something seriously wrong with the filters in your mind and your education about what media does and what mass information is and what fake news is.
Yeah. And another story that struck me was the one relating to banks. I mean, again, indicative of the range of stories that you did. Tell us about that, because that was a consumer story, so to say.
That was a story that we did. That's right. That was a story that we did in 2013, where nearly 200, 300 branches he visited across India of nearly 30, nearly 3 dozen odd banks, both nationalized as well as private bank. The marquee names, so to speak, from SDFC to ICCI to State Bank of India, Union Bank of India, etc. And they were willing to launder the money of a politician in cash, and they were showing us various ways that they could launder that money for you, and which was violation of the PMLA Act and all kinds of act that you could imagine. and it was violation of their own guidelines. And actually, that story led to a lot of impact. It first of all got the RBI into launching an inquiry. It made the RBI fine the banks 2 crores, 5 crores, and huge sums, whereas the original sums of fines used to be 2 lakhs and 1 lakh, if you remember, Manoj. So that was a big mental switch that happened with the regulator. Plus, they brought in a whole series of guidelines about KVC. So KYC. So we had a lot of my friends used to come up to me and said, because of your investigation, we are having to answer so many questions to the banks, and insurance selling, etc. Everything became regulated at that point of time. I think people want to ask questions now.
Yeah.
Messages.
So, we are ready for questions. Okay, that's a good question. How do you manage your resources? Is there a basic thumb rule? How do you manage your sources?
We don't have great resources, and actually, we are not.
I thought the question was sources, not resources. How do you manage your sources?
Oh, sources. Well, you have to always have a thumb rule. Sources are always very difficult to handle. They are generally very finicky creatures. They always think that they are being backstabbed. So you have to handle them with cotton wool most of the time. I mean, there are some excellent sources as well, but they generally also have an inflated idea about themselves and an inflated idea of the content that they are giving you. And they feel that the content that they're giving you is absolutely headline material for weeks out of weeks. And it may be just a 10th page, one single column story. So, but some of them are truly gems. I'm not saying that the ones with this attitude, you have to handle them. It's basically, it's a human relationship thing. And you have to develop trust. You have to break stories. And once you have broken a few stories from them, then the trust comes in. And they start sort of accepting you as a legitimate person to give information to.
Any stories you can tell us in this context?
Well, are there media trials now? I mean, certainly, if you look at the way they are not investigations. Some of these stories which television is doing, especially the way Arnab had been hounding, Riya Chakravarti and others, and making it sound like they were doing a lot of investigative journalism. Not really. I mean, you would be giving investigative journalism a very bad name with the manner of the hounding that was going on. And I admit that some of them in television do sound like media trials, and it shouldn't be like that. I mean, you're not judge, execution, jury. I mean, you're not judge and jury all the time, and it leaves things in a very bad taste, and which is what has led to a lot of people see television in a very bad way. What do you say, Manoj? Do you agree with what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I mean, very often it is some plants from the establishment that are passed off as investigation. It's motivated stuff that is given to you on a platter, and you just swallow and vomit that and pretend to have done some investigation yourself. I mean, that's the kind of media trial that is going on these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is your advice to budding journalists who want to do investigative journalism? Yeah, great question to put to you.
Yeah. You have to have love for the profession. You have to have the love for doing something which may not pay off initially. You have to get the who, where, how, what right. Don't come to the profession just for the glamour of it. I meet a lot of students and who are attracted by the television anchors that they will get famous and so on and so forth. It is not a glamorous world, and especially if you are an investigative journalist, it's about breaking good stories. But right now, I wouldn't really encourage you to become an investigative journalist at this point of time, because I don't see a lot of that happening, and I don't see people putting resources in investigative stories. But then it's also, if any story that you spend, even a profile that you could be spending a lot of time, becomes an investigative profile. So investigative is just nomenclature. The more time you spend on a story, it becomes investigative by the very nature of it. I mean, you could be investigating a cookery show, and then you could get into how the spices are adulterated and where the spices came from and which cook is doing what in the kitchen and are they using good spices, not. So there's a whole range of investigations in all manner of things.
Yeah. So anything that is done with due diligence, with research and rigor would qualify to be called investigative journalism. But I was struck by your suggestion that the time is not opportune for investigative journalism. Will you tell us a little more about that? Why do you say that? I mean, that would be discouraging to journalists. Yeah.
You also feel that, Manoj. All of us feel that the media platforms are not up to it. And if the media platforms are not up for it, and if they are doing planted stuff, and if they become henchmen for the system and the regime, then what does a reporter do? Does he do what the owners and the top editors are telling him to do, even though his heart says that it is not the right thing? The way the reporters were conducting themselves in the Hathras rape case was itself instant. I mean, here was this woman, instead of chasing that story, they were just wanting to sort of take the heat away from the establishment. So if you are a reporter in an establishment which is helping the regime, so to speak, then it's a very sad position to be in. And I wouldn't want that some of them join the profession are in that kind of situation right now. So it's a little tragic that you have to tell people, maybe this profession is not right for you right now.
Or maybe the profession is not right for investigative journalism right now. That's right. Odd phase we are going through.
Yes.
Yeah. So, any more questions? Have we run out of time, or we still could go on?
Yeah, we have run out of time.
Yeah. And I mean, just to sum up, the question that was put to you was, what are the qualifications you need? What are the traits you need for investigative journalism? I thought it is summed up in your title: a taste for trouble. I mean, you need to have that approach where you look at journalism as a labor of love. You're not enticed by glamour or by whatever monetary rewards you expect, but you are in it to get to the truth, and that is a reward in itself. If anything else comes, that's a bonus. But what should drive you is that willingness to face that risk and
a lot of
go
them
wherever that
should be inspired by you itself, Manoj, because Manoj takes a lot of time over the books. He did this in great investigation on the Gujarat riots, and now he's working on a big, grand book on caste, which will look at the whole caste system in India from pre-independence period till now. And Manoj, you are more of a role model than I am, actually. And then he comes out with this book, and we are all waiting for this book to come out from Manoj, actually.
Yeah.
It was great talking to you, Manoj, and I hope that you enjoyed the conversation as much as I enjoyed it.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. I let the focus be on you. It's your book, coming up with this great book. Although you are, instructive and inspiring to me at my age, and I'm sure it will be all the more so to younger journalists and others who follow journalism. Great. It was excellent talking to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Manoj.
All the best.
Thanks a lot. Not for taking the time out.
Right.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.